The engines were loud that night. Not just the cars, but the atmosphere itself. Thousands of NASCAR fans packed the stands, cameras flashing across the speedway like lightning in the dark. The smell of burnt rubber drifted through the air. Pit crews moved with military precision. Reporters chased interviews. Fans screamed Kyle Busch's name from behind barriers, hoping for one more smile, one more autograph, one more rowdy moment. And at first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But after the tragedy that shocked the entire NASCAR world in May of 2026, fans went back and watched the footage again. And suddenly, everything felt different. The pauses, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his voice cracked mid-sentence, the strange moment when he looked away from the camera, almost like he was trying to catch his breath. At the time, nobody thought twice about it. Now, millions can't stop replaying it. Because what looked like an ordinary public appearance would soon become the final video the world would ever see of Kyle Busch alive. And once you notice the signs, you can never unsee them again. For more than 2 decades, Kyle Busch wasn't just a NASCAR driver. He was NASCAR. Loved by millions. Hated by rivals. Feared on the track. Respected by everyone. The nickname, Rowdy, wasn't marketing. It was survival. Kyle raced with aggression that bordered on impossible. He pushed cars beyond their limits. He pushed competitors into emotional breakdowns. And somehow, year after year, he kept winning. 2-time Cup Series champion. More than 200 victories across NASCAR's top divisions. One of the most naturally gifted drivers the sport had ever seen. Fans either cheered for him or prayed someone could finally stop him. But nobody could ignore him. That confidence, that swagger, that relentless fire. Kyle Busch built an entire legacy out of refusing to back down. Even in interviews, he carried an edge that made him magnetic. He didn't speak like a polished celebrity. He spoke like a racer. Raw, honest, emotional, sometimes brutally so. And maybe that's why his death hit so differently. Because people like Kyle Busch don't feel mortal. They feel indestructible. That's what made the final video so haunting. It wasn't filmed in some dramatic setting. No dark music. No emotional goodbye. No grand farewell speech. Just Kyle, being Kyle. At least that's what everyone thought. The footage surfaced from one of his final public NASCAR appearances just days before reports emerged that he had been seriously ill. Fans remember him standing near the garage area in Concord, North Carolina, speaking casually with media members and team staff while preparing for simulator work connected to racing operations. The cameras captured him smiling. But it wasn't the same smile fans knew. It looked thinner somehow. Forced. Like he was trying to convince people he felt okay. When reporters asked simple questions, Kyle answered normally at first. But then viewers later noticed something chilling. His breathing. There were pauses between sentences. Small pauses. Easy to miss in real time. But after the news broke, fans replayed those moments endlessly. Some noticed him swallowing hard before speaking. Others pointed out how pale he looked beneath the studio lights. One clip in particular spread across social media after his death. In it, Kyle briefly turns away from the camera and coughs into his hand before quickly continuing the conversation. At the time, nobody reacted. The interview kept going. The crowd behind him kept laughing. Engines kept roaring in the background. Life moved forward. But after reports surfaced that he had allegedly been dealing with severe breathing problems and coughing blood before his death, that tiny moment became horrifying to rewatch. Suddenly fans weren't watching an interview anymore. They were watching a man trying to hold himself together. And the comments underneath the video became devastating. "I can't believe we missed the signs. He looked exhausted. You can hear it in his voice now. He was fighting something serious. Man, this hurts." For longtime NASCAR fans, the realization felt unbearable. Because Kyle Busch had always looked invincible. Even through injuries. Even through crashes. Even through controversy. He always came back louder. Faster. Angrier. But in those final public moments, something felt different. The fire was still there. But the energy wasn't. Some fans later described a strange atmosphere around the garage that week. Not panic. Not fear. Just an unusual quietness surrounding Kyle's team. Reporters noticed shorter appearances. Less interaction. Fewer media moments than usual. At the time, nobody connected the dots. Why would they? Athletes push through pain all the time. Especially racers. Especially Kyle Busch. But then came another unsettling detail. According to reports released after his passing, Kyle had reportedly become unresponsive during or shortly after a racing simulator session in Concord. And suddenly, fans began connecting everything. The exhaustion, the coughing, the distant expression in his eyes. Even rivals who spent years battling Kyle on the track seemed shaken when the footage resurfaced. Because they saw it too. Not weakness. Not fear. Just a man trying to keep going, even when his body may have been failing him. And somehow, that made it even more heartbreaking. One former teammate reportedly described the final footage as hard to watch now. Not because Kyle looked dramatically ill, but because he didn't. That's what terrified people most. They replayed every frame searching for clues. The way he leaned slightly against the wall during one conversation. The way his eyes briefly closed between questions. The exhaustion buried underneath his trademark confidence. It became more than footage. It became evidence of a silent battle. And as news stations began reporting that Kyle Busch had reportedly been hospitalized with a severe illness in the days surrounding his death, the entire NASCAR world seemed to freeze. Fans gathered outside tracks wearing rowdy shirts in stunned silence. Sports networks interrupted programming. Social media exploded with disbelief. Many refused to believe the rumors at first. Kyle Busch was only 41 years old. 41. For NASCAR fans, that number felt impossible to process. Then came another painful realization. The final video wasn't just sad anymore. It felt haunting. Because once viewers knew what happened, the entire atmosphere changed. Every smile felt heavier. Every pause felt louder. Every second became painful to watch. And there was one moment in particular that completely shattered fans emotionally. Near the end of the clip, Kyle looked directly into the camera after answering a question about racing, family, and the future. For a brief second, he stopped talking. The noise around him faded into the background. And his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Almost like exhaustion finally slipped through the mask. Then he forced another smile. And the interview ended. Nobody watching that moment live could have imagined what would happen next. But within days, everything changed. And when the first official reports began emerging from North Carolina, the NASCAR world entered complete shock. The first alerts appeared quietly. No dramatic breaking news music. No massive headlines yet. Just scattered reports beginning to circulate across social media late at night. Whispers that something was seriously wrong with Kyle Busch. At first, fans refused to believe any of it. Because NASCAR had seen rumors before. False scares. Fake celebrity death posts. Internet chaos. But this felt different. The silence coming from people close to Kyle was unusual. Reporters who normally posted race updates suddenly stopped talking. NASCAR insiders began posting vague messages asking fans to pray. And then came the words that terrified everyone. Hospitalized. Serious condition. Breathing complications. By sunrise, the racing world felt frozen. Outside hospitals in North Carolina, reporters gathered with cameras pointed toward entrances that never seemed to open. Fans stood behind barriers wearing old Kyle Busch jackets and hats, refreshing their phones over and over again. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but fear was spreading fast. According to reports later confirmed by major outlets, Kyle had reportedly been suffering from severe illness symptoms, including breathing problems and coughing blood in the days leading up to the tragedy. Suddenly, the final footage became unbearable to watch, because fans realized he may have already been struggling while standing in front of those cameras. And now, every replay felt like watching someone disappear in real time. Inside NASCAR circles, panic quietly grew. Drivers began receiving calls. Team owners stopped media appearances. Crew members exchanged messages filled with confusion and disbelief. One reporter later described the atmosphere as emotionally paralyzed. Because nobody expected this. Not Kyle Busch. Not Rowdy. Even people who spent years competing against him struggled to process what they were hearing. Some simply went silent. Others posted broken-hearted messages online before any official confirmation had even arrived. And then fans noticed something else. The final public video had suddenly exploded across the internet. Millions of views overnight. People slowed it down frame by frame, analyzing his breathing, his posture, his voice. The comments became more emotional with every hour. You can hear how tired he was. Why didn't anyone stop him? He looked like he was trying so hard to hide the pain. This doesn't feel real. And maybe the most heartbreaking part of all, Kyle Busch still tried to act normal, even while reportedly dealing with symptoms that's serious. That realization shattered people emotionally, because racers are taught to push through pain, through crashes, through injuries, through fear. And Kyle Busch built his entire identity around toughness. Fans remembered all the times he returned after brutal wrecks. The broken leg in 2015. The countless injuries hidden behind interviews and sunglasses. The endless pressure of carrying expectations year after year. He always fought through it. Always. But this time, the battle happening inside his body was invisible. That's what made it terrifying. By the afternoon, NASCAR media coverage began shifting completely. Sports channels stopped discussing races and standings. Instead, every conversation centered around Kyle. Former rivals spoke with shaken voices. Commentators who had covered him for decades suddenly sounded emotional on live television. Because they all understood something at the same time. NASCAR without Kyle Busch felt unimaginable. Fans gathered outside racing shops and team headquarters in silence. Some carried signs. Some simply stood there staring at their phones, hoping for good news that never seemed to come. And all across social media, one clip kept resurfacing. That final interview. That final smile. That final moment where Kyle briefly paused before looking back into the camera. The internet became obsessed with that pause. Not because it revealed some secret, but because now it felt human. Painfully human. People who had never even followed NASCAR began sharing the footage. The emotional weight behind it was impossible to ignore. One fan wrote, "He looked exhausted, but he still showed up for the fans." Another posted, "This is heartbreaking because you can tell he was trying to stay strong." And then came a comment that spread everywhere online. "He gave us one final lap without anyone realizing it." As evening approached, tension across the NASCAR community became overwhelming. Richard Childress Racing remained quiet publicly, but insiders described an emotional atmosphere behind the scenes. Team members reportedly struggled to focus. Crew workers who normally prepared cars with military discipline now stood around television screens waiting for updates. Nobody knew what to say. How do you prepare for the possibility of losing someone who felt larger than the sport itself? And then there was Kyle's family. His wife. His children. The people who knew the real man behind the Rowdy persona. Fans began revisiting old family videos online. Moments with his son at the track. Interviews where Kyle talked about fatherhood softening him over the years. And suddenly, the aggressive superstar NASCAR fans once loved to boo no longer looked intimidating. He looked fragile, human, a father, a husband, a man only 41 years old. That realization broke people emotionally, especially longtime fans who had grown up watching him race. Because Kyle Busch wasn't supposed to become a tragedy story. He was supposed to grow old around the sport. Become one of those legendary veterans still appearing at tracks decades later. Still talking trash. Still smiling that cocky smile. Still making crowds erupt with emotion every time he entered a speedway. Nobody was prepared for the possibility that the story might end here. Late that night, the atmosphere online became almost surreal. Fans stayed awake refreshing news feeds every few minutes. Some prayed publicly. Others simply posted memories. Videos of victories. Burnout celebrations. Emotional father-son moments. Classic, Rowdy interviews. It felt less like sports coverage, and more like people desperately trying to hold on to someone before it was too late. Meanwhile, television networks continued replaying the final footage. And every replay hurt more. Because the signs were impossible to ignore now. The heavy breathing. The exhaustion behind his eyes. The slight cough. The moments where his energy seemed to disappear for a split second. One NASCAR analyst said quietly during a live segment, "It's chilling watching this back now." That sentence alone sent chills through fans everywhere. Because everybody watching felt the exact same thing. And then came reports that Kyle had become unresponsive during or after a simulator session in Concord. That detail devastated the racing world. Not at home. Not away from the sport. But surrounded by racing. Still working. Still showing up. Still trying to be Kyle Busch. It almost felt poetic in the cruelest possible way. Even in his final hours, racing was still part of his life. The thing he loved most. The thing that made him immortal to fans. But by now, fear had turned into something darker. Because the silence from official sources was becoming unbearable. And deep down, people were starting to realize the unthinkable might actually be happening. Then, just as midnight approached, phones across the NASCAR world began vibrating all at once. And the messages appearing on screens were the ones fans had prayed they would never see. Just after midnight, the silence ended. And with it, an entire era of NASCAR seemed to stop breathing. Official statements began appearing almost simultaneously. First from NASCAR. Then from Richard Childress Racing. Then from family representatives struggling to put impossible grief into words. Kyle Busch was gone. Dead at 41 years old. For several minutes, social media felt frozen. Fans stared at their screens in disbelief, hoping the announcements were fake. Hoping someone would correct the story. Hoping Rowdy would somehow survive this too like he survived everything else in his life. But this time, there was no comeback. No miraculous recovery. No next race. No engine roaring back to life. Just heartbreak. Pure heartbreak. Outside race shops and speedways across America, people gathered in silence. Some cried openly. Others simply stood there staring into space wearing old Kyle Busch shirts stained with years of race day memories. And everywhere you looked, that final video kept playing. Over. And over. And over again. Not because fans wanted pain, but because they couldn't let go. The footage suddenly carried a weight nobody could explain. A man smiling while silently struggling. A legend unknowingly saying goodbye. A moment that once felt ordinary, transformed forever by tragedy. NASCAR's official statement described Kyle as one of the fiercest competitors the sport had ever seen. Tributes poured in from every corner of racing. Drivers who once hated racing against him suddenly spoke through tears during interviews. Because rivalry disappears when reality hits. One former competitor said, "You always thought Kyle Busch would be around forever." And honestly, that's exactly how fans felt too. The garages felt quieter after the news broke. Too quiet. The loudest sport in America suddenly sounded empty. Commentators struggled to get through broadcasts without their voices shaking. Television screens filled with highlights of Kyle's greatest moments. Dramatic wins, emotional celebrations, unforgettable battles that defined an entire generation of NASCAR. But strangely, it wasn't the victories affecting people most. It was the final footage. That's what haunted everyone. Because now fans saw details they missed before. The slight tremble in his breathing. The exhaustion hidden behind his smile. The way he paused after certain sentences like his body was trying to slow him down. It no longer looked like a normal interview. It looked like a man trying desperately to push through pain one final time. And perhaps the most heartbreaking realization of all, Kyle Busch never made it about himself. Even in those final public moments, he still answered questions. Still smiled for cameras. Still showed up for fans. That realization shattered Rowdy Nation. Thousands of emotional tributes flooded social media from fans who had spent decades watching him race. Some shared childhood memories of attending NASCAR events with their fathers. Others posted photos wearing Kyle Busch merchandise they'd owned since they were kids. Many admitted they were re-watching the final video repeatedly, even though it hurt. Because grief does strange things to people, especially when the loss feels impossible. One fan comment went viral for a simple reason. "We weren't watching a final interview. We were watching a goodbye we didn't understand yet." That sentence broke millions of hearts. And as the days passed, memorials began appearing outside tracks across the country. Candles, flowers, toy race cars, handwritten notes from children. Fans revved engines in tribute while others stood silently with tears running down their faces. Even people who once booed Kyle Busch found themselves grieving harder than expected. Because love him or hate him, Kyle made people feel something. And that's rare. Very rare. In emotional interviews after the tragedy, teammates described Kyle as fiercely competitive but deeply devoted to family. Behind the aggressive racing persona was a father who adored his children and a husband who carried immense pressure for years while living under the spotlight of one of America's most intense sports. That human side suddenly became impossible to ignore after his death. The superstar image faded. What remained was the man. And maybe that's why the final video became unforgettable. Not because it was dramatic, not because he gave some emotional farewell speech, but because it felt real, painfully real. There were no movie-style warning signs. No soundtrack telling viewers tragedy was coming. Just tiny human moments nobody recognized until afterward. A pause, a cough, a tired expression, a forced smile, and somehow, those ordinary details became devastating once the world understood the ending. Sports psychologists later described the public reaction as collective shock grief. Fans weren't just mourning Kyle Busch the driver. They were mourning the illusion of invincibility. Because athletes like Kyle make fans believe toughness can overcome anything. Until one day, it can't. And the hardest part? Kyle likely had no idea that millions of people would someday analyze those final moments frame by frame searching for meaning. But they did. And they still are. To this day, the footage continues circulating online accompanied by emotional tributes and heartbreaking comments from fans who say they can no longer watch it without crying. Because now every second carries unbearable weight. Every smile feels heavier. Every pause feels haunting. And every moment reminds people how quickly life can change. For NASCAR itself, the loss created a silence that can never fully be replaced. Kyle Busch wasn't just another driver on the grid. He was energy, chaos, emotion, controversy, passion, the kind of personality sports desperately need. The kind fans remember forever. Long after championships fade into history. Long after statistics stop mattering. And maybe that's the final tragedy of all. Nobody realized the last time they were seeing Kyle Busch alive. Not the reporters. Not the fans. Not the people standing beside him. To them, it was just another NASCAR day. Another interview. Another appearance. Another moment in the endless rhythm of racing life. But history had already quietly begun writing its ending. And now, that final footage feels less like a video, and more like a ghost. A frozen moment in time before everything changed forever. In the end, Kyle Busch left this world the same way he lived in it. Still fighting. Still showing up. Still carrying the weight of racing on his shoulders. And somewhere tonight, at tracks across America, fans still hear the echoes. The roaring engines. The screaming crowds. The voice of Rowdy over the radio. Because legends like Kyle Busch don't disappear when they die. They stay alive in memories, in rivalries, in victories, in heartbreak, and in one haunting final video that millions of people will never forget.